Hi, and welcome to the fourth Masterworks concert of the season, which we are calling Firebirds of a Feather. And I'm coming to you from the upstairs gallery here at the Koger Center. And I'm glad that you can join me for this. So this concert features two works by Igor Stravinsky. As you might have guessed from the title or the theme of the concert, to conclude the evening, we are playing the famous Firebird Suite of Stravinsky, the work that was originally written, of course, as a ballet in 1910. And that was his sort of a big break as a composer, especially of ballet music. When you think about Firebird coming in 1910, it's basically what followed for the next couple of years for the Stravinsky is as though if you were, let's say, you're an actor or could be a film director, let's say, and maybe you win your first Oscar, and then boom, boom, you win like 2 more Oscars in a row in the following 2 years. That is basically the kind of success that Stravinsky enjoyed at this early stage in his career. He was still in his 20s actually when these late 20s when these successes started happening for him. So Firebird in 1910, and the name that we should all sort of think of when we think about Stravinsky, Firebird, and of course, Petrushka, that came in 1911, which was followed by the infamous Rite of Spring in 1912. All of these were written for Ballet Russe, and which was a special Russian ballet company based in Paris and Monte Carlo and all these places in Western Europe. And it was created by Sergei Diaghilev, who was became really, that's his legacy, is the creation of Ballet Russe and creation of all these the works like Stravinsky's Firebird, Rite of Spring, and he worked with artists like Picasso and Matisse who did the set design and kind of launched the career of famous choreographers, including that of George Balanchine. So that's sort of the early success that he had. So that's what the Firebird Suite is what we're going to conclude the concert with. And when we were thinking about, Firebird, and confession I have to make is that when I was growing up as a kid in Japan, bird watching was one of my favorite pastimes. And I grew up in this rural part of Japan, right on the ocean, right on the East China Sea. But it was a small town that's, we had the hills and mountains sort of right near us too. So surrounded by water, surrounded by the trees, surrounded by the woods. There was just so many different kinds of birds, species of birds. And I had this, my grandfather gave me this very heavy old binoculars. And I started sort of riding my bicycle as a kid to the river, to the woods, all these places, just kind of see what kind of birds were out there. And that fascination with birds, and I don't know what it is about that. It's that the freedom that it exhibits when it's in flight that fascinates us. There's always there are all these composers, Stravinsky being one, other composers like Messiaen, even Beethoven earlier, who were very much fascinated by birds and wrote music inspired by different bird songs. And here, this concert is sort of, the whole concert is built on this. So we have Firebird to close out the program. And of course, in the Firebird music, you're not going to hear as much, let's say, bird calls or bird songs, let's say. It's obviously the story, this Russian myth, the very popular Russian legend of the Firebird, the mythical creature that is the central focus of that music. But then we are going to open the concert with another piece by Stravinsky, which is more influenced by actual birds, and that is the Song of the Nightingale, which is not as well known as the Firebird or the Rite of Spring. It came originally as an opera, actually. So Stravinsky, before the Firebird fame happened in 1910, he had just finished sort of apprenticing or studying with another famous composer, Rimsky-Korsakov of Scheherazade fame. And Stravinsky was studying with Rimsky-Korsakov. As a matter of fact, some of the earliest pieces that Stravinsky wrote were dedicated to Rimsky-Korsakov. Unfortunately, Rimsky-Korsakov didn't live long enough to see the success of Firebird. But when he was studying with Rimsky-Korsakov, he had an idea. And Rimsky-Korsakov is, today he's really best remembered for Scheherazade. But in his, especially in the later part of his life, he was a very prolific opera composer. And so Stravinsky, being his student, he had an idea to write an opera based on one of the fairy tales by Hans Christian Andersen about the Nightingale. And so he started working on this opera. As a matter of fact, the opera was supposed to be in 3 acts. Act 1, the first one, he finished in 1908. Then, a lot of things happened to his life. All of a sudden, he ended up being discovered by Diaghilev and started working for him. And of course, Firebird was the first big project, followed by Petrushka and The Rite of Spring. And so by the time he went back to this opera, it was after all of this very brief but very transformational period in his life. Not just to his life, but also to his style as well. So he goes back to the opera, kind of finishes the materials like in 1914 to 1915. Then even Stravinsky, looking at it, realized, wait, these are really kind of two different works almost. So he wasn't sure if the opera would succeed. So then he had an idea, being ever a clever man. He decided, well, I have all these musical materials that I wrote for the opera. What if I make a shortened orchestral suite or orchestral like symphonic poem, maybe pulling about 22, 23 minutes of music, and then we'll see if Diaghilev wants to choreograph it or get it choreographed and have it turn into a ballet. And put on by Ballet Russe, because by then, Stravinsky had a very close working relationship with Diaghilev and his ballet company. So that's what he did, and he sort of proposed the idea to get Diaghilev, and Diaghilev was like, well, let me hear it first. So there was like really no hard promises made. So like in 1919 or so, Stravinsky created the piece you're going to hear on this program, Song of the Nightingale. And it's basically like sort of a Cliff Note version of the opera from the story. And he had the orchestral version of that premiered in Switzerland. And Diaghilev apparently liked it. So then he decided to have a creative team assembled of choreographer and set designer and costume designer and so on, including Matisse, who did the set design for this ballet. And then so that happened in 1920, and then a few years later, for one of the new productions of the Song of the Nightingale, Diaghilev decided to use a new choreographer for that particular production, and that was Balanchine. So George Balanchine started working for Diaghilev in 1925, and this was the piece that connected those two. So the Song of the Nightingale has more of a bird calls you will hear throughout this piece. The plot basically centers around the court of the Chinese emperor. And you will hear sort of, at first, you will hear, and this is very much sort of Stravinsky's early influence from Rimsky-Korsakov, who was a master orchestrator. So he was able to create all these different palettes of colors to depict very vivid pictures in his orchestral writing. Scheherazade is a prime example of that. And Stravinsky learned that craft from him. So the opening scene depicts all of these, the porcelain walls and floors reflecting, they're just gleaming with these lights coming from all these golden bowls and lights that are adorning the hallway. And then the emperor and his entourage makes their entrance. So you'll hear a little march. And as they're seated, you will hear the title character, the Nightingale. And Nightingale is first depicted by the solo flute. taken over by solo violin. And it's a beautiful moment. And then eventually, though, the envoy from the Emperor of Japan comes. And of course, they always visited each other's courts, bearing fancy gifts. So what was the gift from the Emperor of Japan to the Emperor of China? It was the mechanical nightingale. And so the mechanical nightingale starts to sing, and that's depicted by flutes and oboes and so on. And of course, the mechanical nightingale is, sings just as well as the real nightingale, so the emperor thought. But then it has the added benefits of being just gilded with gold and silver, and it's just very pleasing to the eye. As well. So the emperor is very much enchanted by this mechanical nightingale. In the meantime, the real nightingale, nobody noticed, but in the meantime, the real nightingale flew away through the open window and goes to this fisherman's house. I guess they were buddies or something. And so the fisherman is happy to see the nightingale, and then the fisherman's happiness is depicted by this little motif in the solo trumpet. That's sort of the first part of the scenario. And then in the second part, so it's in 4 short parts, but it's in like 2 large section chunks. So in the second large chunk, kind of fast forward a little bit. Now the emperor is very ill. So he's sort of, everybody thinks he's on his deathbed. No nightingale, no live nightingale to be found. The mechanical nightingale no longer, they refuse to sing for him anymore. And so you see all of the past deeds, sort of the flashback. It's like emperor seeing his life flashback, like flash in front of him. So all of the good deeds, all of the bad deeds, all the wars and all these things. But then somehow in this moment of crisis, Nightingale returns. And the emperor becomes so overcome with joy that actually he's good to go again. So it's a happy ending, of course. Then having done the miracle healing work, the nightingale goes back to the fisherman. I guess that's where that nightingale was from, and all ends sort of happily ever after. It's very much, as I mentioned, it's very colorful, very unique combination of instruments. When we talk about orchestration or color in music, and of course I'm actually colorblind, so I'm not the best one to be describing this to you probably, but it's sort of how artists, painters, how they can combine different colors, paint, to create new colors. And that's what composers do. So they will take, let's say, they will combine English horn with the flute, maybe also with trumpet or bassoon or something like that. And together, it sounds like a completely different or completely new instrument. So that's one way when we think of tonal palette or color palette in music for composers. And it's so many fascinating moments of this throughout both of these pieces. Of course, Song of the Nightingale, also in the Firebird as well. Musically in Song of the Nightingale, because of the setting that it's set in the court, a Chinese emperor's court. So musically, Stravinsky uses what we call pentatonic scale, which is a 5-note scale. It's kind of the scale you can find in most of these folk songs, folk music from Asia. So he very much relied on basically Asian sounding melodies in a way to evoke the setting for this piece. Go back, rewind a few years back to the Firebird, which is concluding the concert. And as I mentioned, that's based on instead of a Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale, that's based on, Firebird is really very much a Russian folk tale, sort of a Russian myth or legend. Basically two main characters. So you have the Firebird, this mythical creature, and you have this sort of an evil king, Koschei, and Koschei's evil life is preserved inside of this giant egg, which almost starts to sound like a nesting doll because it's also inside of something else, inside of something else. But you have to like use you have to use the needle to pierce it, and that's the only way you can defeat this evil king. Of course, there's a love story wrapped around this too. So there's of course the prince. Prince Ivan, and of course a princess as well, who is being held, along with 12 other princesses, are being held captive by the evil king of Castche. And so it's both sort of a love story, a rescue, but it's all kind of held together by this mythical creature, the Firebird. So you will hear all of this. You will hear in the opening of the suite, you will hear this very low rumbling, mysterious sounding music that rises out of nowhere to start the suite. And that is sort of that kind of depicts the court of Castche, this sort of very, very unnerving kind of world. And then you will hear you will also hear the entrance of the Firebird. And again, this has a little bit of similarity to the beginning, in a way, of the Nightingale suite. And this very glittering, lots of fast-moving notes, very bright, and that kind of depicts all of the gleaming reflections of the magic feather that the Firebird has. Then you will hear you will hear this sort of the round dance. It's a very simple sounding dance, and that's when Prince sees the captive princesses. Of course, his eye latches on one of these princesses. She was the most gorgeous, I guess. So he falls in love with this princess and wants to rescue her and everybody else. So that's sort of the initial setting for the Firebird suite. They sort of concoct a plan to the famous Infernal Dance, which is one of the most famous showpieces in a way for orchestra. And in the scenario, this is where all of the Castche's minions they are lured into, well, basically dance until they can't dance anymore. So it's this whirling, just very out of control, very fast, very energetic, and eventually then they fall asleep, and so to let their guard down, let's say, so then the rescue can happen. Right, so that's sort of what constitutes the end part of this suite. So you will hear sort of everybody slumber out of that the magic piercing of the egg to kill Castche, so to speak, or to sort of free his evil spirit in a way, happens, and then goes to the beautiful sunrise and glorious triumphant conclusion of the suite. And it's been very popular in many different forms. The original ballet takes about 50 minutes or so. The version that is most popular is the version we're going to perform for you on this concert. It's a suite that Stravinsky created in 1919. And it sort of takes about half of what he felt were the best musical moments. So maybe not the moments where he had to create scene change music to accommodate what's happening on the stage with the dancers or with the scenery, but all of the big musical moments of the ballet, he kind of pulled those together to create a suite. There's another suite, so there's an in-betweener. So there's a sort of a 25-minute suite that we are playing, which is the most popular. And then there's the 50-minute original ballet, which is also written for a far larger orchestra than the suite. It's it's not as big as twice as many people, but it's significantly larger orchestra than the 1919 suite. There's an in-betweener from 1945, which he tacked on 10 more minutes or so of music from the original ballet, so it runs about 35 minutes, but still the same size orchestra as the 1919, and that's not performed as often. But this 1919 version of the Firebird suite it's got all of the greatest musical moments, and it's been used in so many films and cartoons since its composition as well. Again, it's one of those brilliant showpieces that the musicians love performing. They embrace the challenge of this piece of Stravinsky's virtuosic writing, and it's also very much a popular piece has been with the audiences around the world. In between the two, we have another bird-inspired piece, and it's actually a concerto for marimba and orchestra. So concerto for solo marimba with orchestra. The actual title of the piece is Bird Rhythmics, and it was written by Japanese composer Takashi Yoshimatsu in 2010. So it's a relatively new piece. Yoshimatsu is not as well known outside of Japan, but he was. If you could just look at the titles of his, like the work list of all the compositions he's written, there's one theme that emerges from just a quick glance at it, in which is most of the pieces he's written are somehow bird inspired. And so he makes no secret of this. The first piece I came to know by Yoshimatsu was a couple decades ago, and it was actually a sonata for alto saxophone and piano, and it's called Fuzzy Bird Sonata. And that was the first piece I got to know by Yoshimatsu. His first orchestral piece that I got to know as a conductor is called Threnody for Toki. And Toki is a very rare, endangered species of bird native to a particular island in Japan. And so that was sort of his breakthrough piece for orchestra. Yeah, if you look at, it's always inspired by some kind of a bird. A couple other influences in Yoshimatsu's style. He just admires the music of Finnish composer Sibelius, particularly his Sibelius's Fifth Symphony, sort of the later Sibelius. But then he was also very much, he grew up when he was self-taught as a composer. He wanted to be a rock musician. So his influence, stylistic, he always lists Sibelius as one of the major influences, and sort of the twin influences. The other huge influence was like a prog rock. So you could hear some of these seemingly kind of divergent influences in a lot of his music, including the piece we're going to share with you on this concert, which is not. I think this might be only the second time or the third time that this piece is performed outside of Japan, and I'm very happy to be joined by one of my colleagues actually at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where I also teach, and also is also Japanese as well. Her name is Ayano Kataoka, and she's going to be joining us here on the Koger Center stage to bring this piece to you. And earlier, I had a chance to sit down with Ayano to talk about this incredible concerto for marimba by Yoshimatsu. So please enjoy.
Okay, hi everyone, and I'm joined by percussionist Ayano Kataoka, who is going to be performing the Bird Rhythmics concerto for marimba by Takashi Yoshimatsu on this program. And so, first of all, well, of course, thank you for joining me for this. I know you're very busy. Especially this week, but thank you for spending a few minutes with me over the Zoom, even though our offices are literally like right across the hallway.
It's true.
For this purpose, I think it's better to do it this way over the Zoom. But anyway, so I think Yeah, let's first start off with, if you could share with us a little bit about your background and, how how percussion became your calling, in a way.
Okay, well, thank you for having me today. My name is Ayano Kataoka. I'm from Japan originally, and I started marimba when I was 5 years old. And I happened to meet this instrument at a kindergarten where I went. It was 5 minutes away from my house. And the kindergarten had a very unique educational system, basically, and had a basically various music teacher, like violin teacher, piano teacher, electronics, organ, and like drum set. Then there was a marimba teacher. Oh, so yeah, that's kind of lucky that I had marimba as one of the choices. Also, I started with piano and violin first, but I didn't like violin, so I quit violin after 1 year. Then my mother found out about, oh, there's a marimba teacher, and marimba is such a beautiful wooden sound that she really loved. In fact, there was a marimbist that he was very active in United States originally, but eventually got back to Japan, and he was one of the really kind of dedicated to really bring the marimba as an instrument, and then developed the marimba education in Japan. His name is Yoichi Hiraoka, and he was holding a radio program in United States when he was in United States. So that was quite a unique sort of historical background that the Japan has uniquely. So that's probably one of the reasons why there are lots of Japanese marimbists being active.
Yeah, I was wondering about that because I know a few, marimba specialists, percussionists, but like they are marimbists.
Yeah.
So like, especially in the US as well.
Yeah.
But I didn't realize that, because you do, I mean, you teach percussion, obviously, you perform on, all sorts of percussion instruments, of course, but I wasn't sure, I didn't know that you went into it through marimba. I wasn't sure if you went through like snare or drum set or something like that, but it was through marimba. So that's great.
Many of them. Yes. When I got to college, I went to undergrad music program in Japan as well. And many of my colleagues, percussion student around me was like coming from brass band, wind ensemble at high school, coming from that kind of background. And I was probably one of the fewer one who had a strong marimba background. But there are conservatories in Japan that like a marimba as a major, so marimba major that you can take.
Very specific track.
Yeah, but I didn't go for that. I kind of wanted to have more diverse, not only marimba to focus for. So anyway.
Yeah, so I guess the next question is sort of a natural lead-in now to our next question. Is that, some of our concert goers, oftentimes when you go to an orchestra concert, oftentimes you see like a piano soloist or a violin soloist or cello soloist, and so on. But not often, you would see a marimba soloist. And as an instrument, maybe some of our concert goers and listeners, if you're seated in our concert hall, when you look at the stage, you see the strings, all the violins, violas, cellos, they're kind of occupying the front of the stage right in front of me. And you have the winds, woodwinds, and brass, and so on. And percussionists are often sort of in the back, back of the ensemble, whether it's an orchestra or wind ensemble and a concert band and so on. So maybe, some of our listeners might not be as familiar with the instrument, itself. Like what is really a marimba? And I think you might have it. I think you have the instrument sitting right next to you, but like for those who are not as familiar with the instrument, how would you describe it? What's sort of the I guess origin, so to speak, of the instrument, and what makes marimba unique in a way?
Mhm. Yeah, sure. So marimba was originally from Africa. So it's so-called baraphone. That is lots of the actually the word marimba is ma and rimba, and then rimba is the wooden board, and then the ma is the plural. So lots of marimba, I mean the wooden bars. So that collected bars to make a wooden instrument, keyboard instruments. That's the kind of the meaning of the marimba. And but as a sort of like a more concert manufactured sort of as instrument became as an instrument, as a one of the concert soloistic instrument. Is that is more likely we had to wait until like 20th century. Then those came from Mexico or Guatemala. Yeah, they had this like marimba music to band to play. So that was the eventually became marimba being featured as a soloistic instrument. So has a huge resonators on the bottom of the bar to amplify the wooden sound, and each bar is very kind of shaped like an arc, and then it's actually very thin, and it's tuned by having this arc. And basically each bar is on this resonator, and then goes through this resonator to have the sound being ring and then amplified. So especially has a really rich sound towards the let's say if you say middle C, and from there we have 2 octaves below. That's the lowest. So we have a 5 octave as a instruments that became standard. So has a really rich sound towards the end, the lower end, because of the resonator particularly. But then as you go to the higher range, it has a more less resonant, but more wooden itself, like a drier sound that associate with xylophone, which is more you will see in the orchestra in the band. So I would say kind of also developed from the xylophone. So it's sort of a bigger kind of father of the the wooden keyboard instrument.
Yeah, I've seen you and your students here at UMass, putting together, like assembling, transporting and assembling marimbas. Right. It's a huge undertaking, and it has many components, and
How many feet though? Like 7 to 9 feet, maybe? Yeah.
It's bigger than you think, actually, because especially when you see it in front of the orchestra as a solo instrument, you will see how large this instrument really is.
Yeah, even like so here I use this called mallet, and if I hold mallet like that, and then if I extend my arm, then still probably I wouldn't be able to reach from the bottom to the top. So that's how long, and I'm short, so I'm like 5 feet, so 6, 7, maybe 7 feet ish at least. Yeah, that's the length.
So and then it's you mentioned like sort of the origin of the instrument way back, like in Africa, and that sort of plays into the piece that we'll be performing together. This piece called Bird Rhythmics. Yoshimatsu. And Yoshimatsu It's an interesting background. He actually he was basically self-taught as a composer. He didn't major in music. He went to
Mhm.
Keio Universities, which is one of the most famous universities in Japan. Started as pre-med, I think, switched to engineering,
Yeah.
and then he quit. He didn't finish his degree and started working as started composing. He was studying with composition. Sort of he had a teacher during some of that time in college, but he's his influences. I mean, his inspirations are very wide ranging. He always cites music of Sibelius as a major source of inspiration and influence. And you can hear some of that, like in the middle movement of this concerto. But also, I mean, he used to play keyboard in a rock band. So, he was like a huge fan of prog rock. I mean, he loves Pink Floyd. Emerson,
Actually, I was gonna say,
yeah,
yeah, I was gonna say the end of the first movement in this concerto, it's really coming from progressive rock.
yeah. You can
So
you, you can hear all of those,
yeah,
influences.
is
Music.
that like Emerson, Lake,
Yeah,
and Palmer?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, that's exactly.
yeah, yeah. He actually orchestrated Tarkus by Emerson, Lake and Palmer for like full symphony orchestra. So
Yes, that's exactly how it is. It sounds like in the end of the first movement, you will recognize it.
yeah, exactly. So it's very interesting piece, but he says in the first movement, it's in three movements. In the first movement, it's called Bird Code, and he's also fascinated by birds. So many of his pieces have some kind of bird reference in the title. He became famous. His breakthrough piece was a string orchestra with piano. Essentially, the string piece called Threnody for Toki. And Toki is a Japanese bird that was basically almost extinct, basically, when he wrote it. But and that was my introduction to his music. And it's also an example of how he uses, in a lot of his pieces, he does use sort of contemporary music technique, but it's very tonal. Because he was sort of against all the avant-garde movement that he saw around him when he was young. I think he's turning 70 this year. But when he was a young composer, everybody was writing very much, academic, very brainy, like avant-garde music, and he didn't want to write that. So that was sort of, that's his style. He kind of led sort of post avant-garde kind of movement where he's incorporating prog rock and all these influences too. And it's fascinating. But in the first one, the image is, and also this, I think, to me feels similar to how Sibelius wrote. Is that sometimes Sibelius in some of his symphonies, we start out with all these little fragments, and sometimes they feel kind of random at the beginning, but there's this organic process in which he will, by the end of the movement, he will kind of use all those as building blocks to build something that is grand and something that makes really like a sense, a logical sense to the listeners. And kind of that's what Yoshimatsu does, in the first movement, right? Because we have all these, it's like little, and it sounds like it makes it sound, what was the imagery? Like he's saying, like he was imagining all those years ago when marimba was developed, or maybe even before marimba was an instrument, these people in Africa hearing the birds and like have some wooden sticks, and they're
to imitate what.
get together trying to mimic different birds.
Yeah, right.
And it's kind of picking the sticks off the ground and just like, hey, this sounds like that bird, this and that kind of builds and builds, and as you mentioned, kind of goes into that prog rock influence.
Right.
So that's very kind of typical Yoshimatsu style. And in the second movement, you got he's imagining at first like sort of the drops of rain, like raindrops. And that's sort of in your rhythm, like how the rhythm, the repeated pitch, but it just sounds like something that's bounced in a way. And then it turns into this sort of rain dance.
Right. Also, he was talking about the tremolo technique, which is for us to. So one of the kind of disadvantage of this instrument is we don't have a pedal or some sorts that we can't sustain once you hit the note, the bar, and then it goes gone. So to be able to sustain the tremolo, continuous sort of hitting is the way to sustain the note. But then that was something that he was not quite sure that technique is really can be integrated in the music. And then sort of his imagination was to sort of transform to the rain by this striking consistent note to be a more like a rainy sound rather than sort of sustain as just like a technical sound, which I think it was a really interesting approach, and then worked really well.
Interesting too, because usually when we do a lot of solo repertoire or concerto for marimba, they do take advantage of that.
Right.
It's a lot more. This one, it's interesting because I feel like he doesn't use that as much, but he uses it. I mean, when he does use it, it's noticeable because he doesn't do them all the time. But otherwise, you're just playing a lot of these rhythmical passages, throughout the whole range of the instrument, and that kind of translates to a lot of the initially. When he was commissioned to write this, and he wrote it in 2010, I think, his initial idea was that the string players in the orchestra would only play pizzicato for the whole thing.
Right.
So just plucking their strings for the entire thing, not using the bow. And apparently the orchestra that premiered the concerto in Japan, the musicians convinced him that that was a bad idea. It's like they're here, so he did change his mind, but there's quite a bit of it. I mean, quite a bit of the string writing is pizzicato. So it, again, doesn't have the sort of the resonating quality. It has the more the percussive quality.
Right. Yeah. Kind of come to our sort of character as an instrument,
that was interesting. That was an interesting, sort of decision on his part, as well. And the other thing is, and so the title of the concerto is Bird Rhythmics. This is okay. I know this gets into like a Japanese lesson for our listeners, but because people are like, what does that mean? Like, what does the title mean, really? And he said, well, it's because, and you will hear this in the piece, especially like in the outer movements, especially like in the last third movement, which is very rhythmic, very festive. There are different sets of grooves going on in the orchestra, but like a lot of those instruments are assigned to a different percussionist. So, so in addition to the marimba solo part, there are 3 percussionists in the orchestra, and they play a key role. They're almost like the sub-soloists in a way in this piece. And each of them are in charge of the different groove, and the orchestra, different sections of the orchestra are sort of assigned to different groove. And so it's, in a way, he thought of it as like polyrhythm. So polyrhythm, so poly, so many rhythms, so various rhythms or grooves going on simultaneously. When you say that in Japanese, it's just simply polyrism. And poly, he thought sounded like tori. Tori is the word for bird. So it's just really like a play on word that he's kind of cooked up. So like bird rhythmics, torirism. So then it's like polyrhythm sounded similar to him.
Yes.
Worked out well. But yeah, so it's it's a I know there are actually when I was in South Carolina last week, one of the musicians in the orchestra came up and he was so excited that we're doing a piece by Yoshimatsu because he's also a composition student in the university, and he was just so excited that we're finally doing a piece of his, and so I'm hoping, our hope is that many of our listeners who are not familiar with his music yet will fall in love with this piece and kind of become a gateway in a way to exploring his other pieces too. He's quite a prolific composer now, so
His publishing company is in London, right? The English, the Chandos or something.
Yeah, actually, a lot of people in outside of Japan actually, how they first got to know his music was through. It's kind of interesting story. There was a Japanese Japanese conductor, Sachio Fujioka. He now works primarily back in Japan, but he studied in England, and he made his professional debut in London. The president of that record company, Chandos, was at the concert, and he thought this conductor was really talented, wanted to offer him a chance to make a CD under his label. And so went up to Mr. Fujioka and said, okay, you can record anything you want. Yeah, we'll give you one CD to record with a BBC Philharmonic. And Fujioka-san said, basically, okay, I want to do an all Yoshimatsu disc. And the president of Chandos had never didn't know his music, Yoshimatsu's music at the time. This was like, I think in the 90s, and didn't know his music. So he said, so the president of the company asked this conductor, he said, okay, well, we'll take your word for it. That was not expected. They thought he was doing a Tchaikovsky symphony or, something, a big romantic symphony or something. Instead, he said he wanted to make a CD of single composer's work and somebody who was not quite well known at the time outside of Japan. And so Fujioka-san said, yeah, trust me, he's a great composer. So just based on that word, they arranged this recording session. And then the composer Yoshimatsu flew to London for the session. Funny thing was, Yoshimatsu and Fujioka had never actually met before that. It was the first time they actually met. But then they made that recording, and they ended up making like 6 or 7 albums.
Oh, wonderful!
Of his music under that English label, and that's how like his music became known. So,
I see.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting like chance encounter, and that's sort of thing about.
Wonderful. Yeah, I hope his music is more, being played in United States or this side of the country. Yeah, it would be really nice. So this has been premiered, right, in United States.
I believe so. Yeah.
So, but
the person who premiered it, Nanae Mimura, I think she performed it in the US also. So
well, I met her when I was in Japan, and she said she was surprised that it's been premiered, the US premiere happens, because I don't think she has done it.
Oh, she didn't do it. So maybe maybe this is the US premiere. I don't know. We should check.
Yeah, she said she has done 6 times in Japan.
In Japan, but not never outside. Oh.
No, I don't. Yeah, that's my understanding. I can check with her again.
I know the piece was done in Brazil because one of my mentors, he's from Brazil originally, and he has an orchestra in Brazil, and they did it a couple years ago. I know it's been done in Brazil, but I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so You could be witnessing the North American premiere of this concerto.
Maybe.
I should
Wow.
find out.
I'm quite
I should find out
no,
before
I'm
the concert, actually. Right.
nervous. Okay. Quite a, a responsibility for me to play. So,
Well, yeah, but you and I actually we performed it in a way, so so um
try out. Yeah, right. Once.
so okay, so I should check. Now the thing also, if any of if any if any musicians come upon this video, um and if they're curious about performing his music, now he's self-published, so it's actually easier to get a hold of his scores, his sheet music outside of Japan now. That used to be very difficult. I remember doing a saxophone concerto of his several years back, and it literally had to come from the record company in England. That's how we managed to get it. But now, like, his people have their own like publishing firm, and that's how we were able to get this performance materials for this performance. So yeah,
Wonderful.
yeah.
Mhm.
Well, anyway,
Yes.
thank you, Ayano-san.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the opportunity, and I'm really looking forward to playing with your orchestra.
Great fun to work with you again. So
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you at the concert.